My name is Naomi Prescott. And the day Evan Whitmore fired me, he believed he was finally stepping out of his father's shadow. What he didn't realize was that I had designed the shadow. He had spent 32 years watching his father build something extraordinary. Watching from the sidelines at board dinners as a teenager, watching from a corner office as a junior VP in his late 20s, watching from a distance even when Daniel Whitmore handed him the CEO title 18 months ago. A title Daniel had held with quiet authority for 2 decades before a diagnosis changed the timeline. Evan had watched his father command rooms with nothing more than presence and precision, and he had catalogued every gesture, every pause, every strategic silence, and decided that what he was seeing was power. He was wrong about what he was seeing. But I will get to that. First, I need to tell you about the morning he fired me. It was a Tuesday in March. The kind of cold, flat Manhattan morning where the light through the glass towers looks like it was filtered through concrete. I arrived at Whitmore Systems at 7:40, the same time I had arrived for the past 9 years. I made coffee in the executive kitchen on the 14th floor. I reviewed overnight logistics flags from our European distribution centers. I answered 4 emails from vendors and 1 from a compliance officer in Singapore. I was reading a routing anomaly report when Evan's assistant appeared at my office door. He'd like to see you in the large conference room. I noticed she did not make eye contact. I noticed she was holding her tablet with both hands. I picked up my notepad and walked down the hall. There were 30 people in that room. I counted as I entered, because I count things by habit. Senior leadership. 2 board members. The general counsel. 3 people from HR. And, standing near the window with his arms crossed and the skyline behind him like a stage set, Evan Whitmore, 32 years old, tailored charcoal suit, jaw set with the particular tension of a man who has rehearsed a moment many times and is now terrified of delivering it. Security was positioned near the door. He had planned this. He wanted an audience. He wanted the board members present so they could see him act. He wanted 30 witnesses to the exact moment Evan Whitmore stopped being Daniel Whitmore's son and became his own man. I sat down at the end of the table nearest the door and folded my hands on my notepad. Naomi, he said. Effective immediately, your employment with Whitmore Systems is terminated. He let the sentence sit. He had practiced the pause. I could tell. What is the stated cause? I asked. My voice was even. I was interested in the answer in the way a surgeon is interested in a scan, clinically, without effect. Strategic restructuring. I held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Strategic restructuring. Not performance. Not conduct. Not cause. Those 2 words mattered more than he could possibly have understood, because they were the trigger language in a clause buried in Appendix C of an agreement he had never read. I had been part of the team that drafted that agreement 4 years ago, during a quiet period of corporate restructuring that Daniel Whitmore had approved over a single afternoon meeting and 2 cups of black coffee. I stood. I gathered my notepad. I collected my phone from the table surface. As I walked past Evan toward the door, I paused at his shoulder and said quietly, "You may want to revisit Appendix C of the restructuring agreement before close of business today." He didn't respond. I felt him resist the urge to ask what I meant. He didn't want to give me the satisfaction in front of 30 people, didn't want to look as if the woman being walked out by security knew something he didn't. He would have time to regret that later. I walked to the elevator. I pushed the button for the lobby.
I wrote down alone, watching the numbers
descend, and I thought about Daniel Whitmore and a conversation we'd had in this same elevator 6 years ago, when the building was still only half full and the company was still finding its legs. "You're the most dangerous person in this organization," he had told me. He was smiling when he said it. "Why?" I asked. "Because you understand what holds it together. And most people don't." He was right. And now his son was about to learn that lesson the expensive way. Let me take you back 17 years, because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. Daniel Whitmore founded Whitmore Systems with exceptional instinct and almost no operational structure. He had visioned the way certain people have perfect pitch, naturally, completely, without effort, and he had the social authority that turns vision into investment. Within 3 years, he had built a distribution and logistics platform that served mid-size manufacturers across the eastern United States. Within 7, it was national. Within 10, it was competing at a level that attracted the attention of institutional investors and, eventually, a Fortune 500 acquisition inquiry that Daniel declined with polite finality. He declined it because he knew the company was worth more than anyone was currently offering. He was right about that too. What Daniel did not have was the structural architecture to match his growth rate. The systems were patchwork. The vendor relationships were relationship dependent, not contract dependent. The data infrastructure was held together by the institutional knowledge of a handful of people who had been there from the beginning, and if 3 of them left in the same quarter, something critical would break. He knew this. It kept him up at night. He told me once, in a moment of unusual candor over coffee after a particularly brutal quarter, that he could feel the company outrunning itself. "It's like the engine is bigger than the frame," he said. "Eventually the frame cracks." He was right. The frame was showing stress fractures in several places when I arrived. I joined Whitmore Systems in year 6, hired as Director of Operational Strategy with the mandate to turn patchwork into architecture. I had come from a consulting background. 10 years of building operational frameworks for companies scaling faster than their internal structures could support. I had worked with manufacturers, logistics companies, 2 technology platforms that had nearly collapsed under their own growth. I understood the problem at Whitmore immediately, because I had seen versions of it a dozen times before. What I had not always encountered was a founder who genuinely understood what he didn't know. Daniel Whitmore was unusual in that specific way. Most founders at his stage, successful, celebrated, accustomed to being the smartest person in their category, have developed a powerful resistance to hearing their company has structural problems. They experience it as personal criticism. They defend against it reflexively. Daniel received it as information. He asked questions. He studied documentation. He came to every meeting prepared to change his mind if the data justified it. He also gave me room to work in a way I had not always been given. He didn't hover over the build. He asked for quarterly reviews, attended them fully, and then let me execute. That is rarer than it should be at the senior level, and I told him so once, early in my tenure. He waved it off. "I hired you because you know more about this than I do," he said. "Why would I second-guess you?" He never did. Not once in 17 years. That professional trust, built deliberately and maintained carefully over nearly 2 decades, became the foundation of something I would need to explain to a board of directors years later, after his son decided to turn it into a rumor. What I built over the next decade was not complicated to explain, but it was extraordinarily difficult to replicate. The global vendor matrix came first. A structured, contract-governed network of 214 vendors across 12 countries, tiered by capability and reliability score, with automatic renegotiation triggers and backup substitution protocols built into every tier. Before I built it, vendor relationships lived in sales directors' email folders. Afterward, they lived in a governed system that could survive the departure of any individual person. Then the logistics routing algorithm. Proprietary modeling logic that optimized distribution routing in real time based on 12 variables, including weather delays, carrier performance data, regional demand fluctuations, and fuel cost indices. It saved Whitmore Systems approximately $9 million in its first operating year. Within 3 years, it had become so embedded in daily operations that most of the logistics team didn't fully understand how it worked. They just knew that when they ran the model, it gave them the right answer. The inventory harmonization model followed, then the compliance automation engine for our international regulatory filings. Each piece connected to the others. Each piece made the others more valuable. Together they formed something that was no longer just a set of tools, it was a system with its own internal logic, and that system was the reason Whitmore Systems could do what it did at the scale at which it did it. Daniel understood this. He appreciated it with the quiet respect of a man who knows he is watching something he could not have built himself. 3 years before he died, he called me into his office on a Friday afternoon in November. Rain on the glass. A half-finished cup of coffee on his desk. He was already showing some of the signs, though the diagnosis was still 3 months away. "I want to talk about the company's structure," he said. We talked for 4 hours. What emerged from that conversation, and from 6 weeks of subsequent legal and financial consultation, was a restructuring proposal I had been considering informally for 2 years. The logic was simple. The operational infrastructure that ran Whitmore Systems, the algorithms, the modeling systems, the vendor architecture, the compliance engines, was distinct from the brand and the holding entity. It had been built separately, documented separately, and could, with proper legal structuring, be licensed separately. Thus was born Prescott Strategic Infrastructure LLC. The entity was incorporated quietly, disclosed fully to the board, approved at a regularly scheduled governance meeting attended by 7 of 9 board members, and noted in the minutes of that meeting under Operational Restructuring, Infrastructure Licensing Agreement. The licensing agreement was clean, detailed, and explicit. Whitmore Systems paid Prescott Strategic Infrastructure a licensing fee for access to the operational systems. The systems remained the intellectual property of the LLC, not of Whitmore Systems. And on page 41 of that agreement, in Appendix C, under Protective Clauses and Review Mechanisms, was the following provision. In the event of termination without demonstrated cause of the designated licensing architect, defined as the individual holding the title of Chief Operating Officer or equivalent at Whitmore Systems and identified as the primary point of contact for the licensing relationship, the licensing agreement shall automatically enter a mandatory review and renegotiation window of 30 business days. During this window, all licensing terms shall remain operative but subject to renegotiation. If renegotiation is not completed within the 30-day window, the agreement lapses into a transition period during which Whitmore Systems must demonstrate alternative operational infrastructure capability or accept revised licensing terms. Termination without cause. Strategic restructuring. Those were Evan's exact words. He had just activated a clause he didn't know existed, in an agreement he had never read, built into the operational backbone of a company he thought he understood because he had watched his father run it. The whisper campaign began within 24 hours of my departure. I expected it. Evan didn't start it directly. He was too measured for that, or at least measured enough to know that being seen to start it would create a separate problem. But he allowed it. He cultivated it in the way that practiced managers cultivate things, by declining to stop them, by failing to correct the record, by allowing the absence of denial to do the work of confirmation. The murmur moved through the senior leadership floor with the efficiency of something that had been waiting for permission. That Naomi Prescott had been unusually close to Daniel Whitmore. That her influence within the company had never been properly explained by professional merit alone. That perhaps the real nature of her authority was something other than what it appeared to be on an org chart. It was the kind of rumor that requires no evidence to propagate, because it lives entirely in implication and because its premise is self-sealing. If you push back on it, you are being defensive. If you ignore it, it spreads. If you address it professionally, people say where there is smoke there is fire. The rumor is designed to be immune to contradiction. That is the architecture of it. That is why people who deploy it use it. I understood this. I had understood it for a long time. What I also understood was that the rumor served a purpose beyond simple character assassination. It was a reframing device. If Naomi Prescott's authority had been the product of personal closeness rather than professional capability, then Evan Whitmore's decision to terminate her became not an act of reckless governance but an act of correction. A new leader finally addressing a situation that should have been addressed long ago. The rumor transformed his mistake into his justification. It was clever, in its way. It would have worked, in many environments. It did not work here because Daniel Whitmore had anticipated it. 5 years earlier, during a capital raise that required rigorous investor due diligence, one of the institutional investors had raised the question carefully. Not directly, no one ever raises these things directly. But in the language of questions about management structure and considerations around key person dependency. The investor's concern was framed as professional. It was also personal. I was in the room for part of the due diligence session, and I had watched the question being constructed, and I had recognized what was being built underneath the professional framing. Daniel had recognized it too. He had addressed it in the session directly, and then, in his characteristically precise way, he had addressed it in writing afterward, a formal memo entered into the investor audit record. The memo's key passage. Naomi Prescott's authority within this organization is structural and contractual. It is documented, board-approved, and operationally verifiable at every level. The systems she has built are the reason this company scales. The governance structures she has designed are the reason this company is an investment-grade entity. Any suggestion that her position within this organization reflects anything other than demonstrated professional capability is a reflection of the assumptions of the person making the suggestion. It is not a reflection of reality. He had written that. In an official document. In a capital raise audit file that was stored, indexed, and retrievable. When my legal counsel surfaced it during the licensing review, and it was placed in front of the board, something shifted in that room in a way that was almost physical. Thomas Reed read it twice. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at Evan with the expression of a man who has just understood something he did not previously understand about the situation in front of him. Evan had deployed the rumor. And the board had just received a document, written by his father, describing precisely the kind of person who would deploy such a rumor, and precisely what it said about them. He didn't look decisive anymore. He looked exactly like what his father had anticipated, someone whose insecurity was showing in the worst possible setting. The infrastructure instability began on day 3. It did not announce itself dramatically. It never does with systems, drama is for people. Systems express distress quietly, in lag times and error rates and queues that lengthen by minutes rather than hours. The first flag was a vendor synchronization error affecting 7 suppliers in the Southeast distribution cluster. IT resolved it within 4 hours, noted it as an anomaly, and moved on. The second flag came the following morning, distribution routing latency in the Midwest network, the kind of delay that translated to roughly 12 additional hours on 3 delivery chains. The compliance verification queue was the one that caused the most internal attention. Whitmore systems operated under federal and state regulatory requirements that mandated timely processing of certain documentation. The queue didn't fail. It just slowed. 8% longer processing times on day 3. 14% on day 4. Not a crisis yet. But enough to make a compliance officer sit up and start asking questions. The answer to those questions was the same every time. The operational infrastructure had entered review state. Prescott Strategic Infrastructure LLC had formally notified Whitmore Systems General Counsel that the licensing agreement was in its mandatory review window under Appendix C. All systems remained operational. All licensing terms remained in effect. But the relationship was under legal review, and certain system-level integrations were in a conditional state pending the outcome of that review. This was disclosed to the board in a memo. It was also disclosed, legally and necessarily, to Whitmore Systems' major institutional investors. The language used was careful, temporary operational recalibration related to infrastructure licensing review. But institutional investors have seen enough governance crises to read between the lines of careful language, and the reading was not reassuring. Then the Wall Street Journal ran a brief item in its markets section. The headline was 15 words. Whitmore Systems faces governance questions following abrupt departure of Chief Operating Officer. The article cited 2 anonymous sources with knowledge of the situation. It noted that Whitmore Systems had seen significant operational changes in the week following the departure of its COO of 9 years. It referenced the licensing review without explaining it fully, which meant the financial press was left to speculate, and financial press speculation is rarely conservative. The stock was down 4% by noon. By 3 in the afternoon, it was down 7%. The institutional investors began calling the board directly. Evans' first response was predictable. He authorized an emergency rebuild initiative. He assembled a team of internal IT architects and instructed them to replicate the routing algorithm and the vendor access framework from scratch. The team worked through the weekend. On Monday morning, they came back with an assessment. The routing algorithm was not replicable in any reasonable timeframe. The modeling logic had been built over 8 years, trained on 9 years of proprietary operational data, and integrated into 17 dependent systems at the code level. To reverse engineer it without access to the original documentation that lived in the intellectual property portfolio of Prescott Strategic Infrastructure LLC, would require between 14 and 20 months of development time, a budget of approximately $34 million, and no guarantee of equivalent performance. Evans' second move was to argue IP transfer under the severance dispute. His attorneys filed a claim asserting that the operational systems had been developed by an employee of Whitmore Systems during her term of employment and therefore constituted property of Whitmore Systems under standard work-for-hire doctrine. This argument was shut down within 48 hours. The licensing agreement, executed 4 years earlier and board-approved, contained explicit language establishing that the operational infrastructure was the intellectual property of Prescott Strategic Infrastructure LLC. The work-for-hire doctrine does not apply to intellectual property that has been formally separated into a licensed entity and documented as such in a board-approved agreement. Evans' attorneys knew this. They made the argument anyway, because he needed them to try something. His third move was to attempt emergency capital restructuring, an attempt to dilute the company's dependency on the licensed infrastructure by acquiring competing vendors and substituting systems at an accelerated rate. The board stepped in before this reached the execution stage. An emergency capital commitment of that magnitude, made under governance stress conditions, required board approval. The board declined to approve it. Because now it wasn't about me. It was about whether Evan Whitmore had the judgment to lead a company through a governance crisis that he himself had triggered. The emergency governance session was held on a Thursday, 17 days after my departure. I attended as a vendor representative. The designated point of contact for Prescott Strategic Infrastructure LLC, which had a contractual right to be represented in any renegotiation session under the terms of Appendix C. I had not been in that building in 17 days. I walked through the lobby with my counsel, signed the visitor log, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The woman at the reception desk, who had worked with me for 6 years, gave me a small, careful nod as I walked past. I nodded back. The lobby felt different. Or maybe it felt exactly the same, and I was the thing that had changed. No longer an insider moving through familiar space but a vendor entering a client's building with documented leverage and a very specific objective. The boardroom was full. 9 board members, the general counsel, 2 outside counsel firms, Evan and his 4-person team on one side of the long table, my counsel and I on the other. The room smelled the way boardrooms always smell when the stakes are high, the particular combination of recycled air and ambient stress that has no name but is instantly recognizable. Thomas Reed was chairing the session. He was 67 years old, had served on 4 public company boards, and had the particular authority of someone who has seen enough corporate mismanagement to recognize it instantly and has no patience for performing patience about it. He had known Daniel Whitmore for 20 years. He had voted to approve the infrastructure licensing agreement. He had, I suspected, spent the past 17 days being profoundly annoyed. He opened by having outside counsel present the licensing agreement in full. The structure was laid out methodically. What Prescott Strategic Infrastructure owned, what Whitmore Systems had licensed, what the protective clause provided, what the mandatory review window required, and what the operational and financial consequences of the current review state had been over the preceding 17 days. The presentation was 38 minutes. Nobody interrupted. I watched the board members as the numbers were presented. The stock decline, the distribution delays, the compliance queue backlog, the institutional investor calls. Each number landed on the room with a different weight. Evan sat very still throughout. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand that he did not use. When the presentation concluded, Reed looked at Evan. "Before we discuss the path forward," he said, his voice entirely level, "I have one question. Did you consult legal counsel before terminating the operational architect responsible for maintaining the licensing relationship with our primary infrastructure provider?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. I have learned, over the years, to read corporate silences by their texture. Some silences are strategic, the pause before a practiced answer. Some are genuine, the pause of a person formulating something true. This silence was neither. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to defend a position or abandon it, and arriving at neither. "The termination was made under strategic restructuring authority," Evan said finally. "Standard executive discretion." "Standard executive discretion," Reed repeated. The phrase had a different quality when he said it. Flatter. More precise. "Did you read this agreement?" He held up the licensing document, "before exercising that discretion?" Another pause. "I was briefed on it," Evan said. Across the table, I kept my expression neutral. I had spent 17 years learning to keep my expression neutral when it mattered, and this was the moment it mattered most. The temptation was to let something show, some flicker of vindication, some acknowledgement of what I was briefed on it really meant in this context. I did not allow it. My job in that room was not to be satisfied. My job was to be a vendor representative, and vendor representatives do not have feelings about governance failures. They have positions on renegotiation terms. I looked at the table in front of me and waited. Reed set the document down. He looked at the full board. Something passed between the 8 of them, not words, not gestures, just the shared recognition of people who have been in enough rooms to know when a conclusion has been reached. The motion was made by board member Caroline Voss, who had served 11 years and who spoke with the efficient precision of someone who has made difficult motions many times before and has no interest in softening them unnecessarily. "I move to suspend the Chief Executive Officer pending a formal competency and governance review, effective immediately, with an independent operating committee assuming executive authority during the review period." It was seconded in under 5 seconds by board member Hugh Aldrin. The vote was called. 7 in favor. 2 abstentions. 0 against. Not close. Not even close. Evan sat very still as the result was announced. He did not argue. He did not stand. He did not do the thing I had half expected him to do, which was reach for the practiced authority he had tried to carry into that conference room 17 days earlier. The 30 witnesses, the security near the door, the skyline behind him like a backdrop. There was no backdrop here. There was just a table, a vote count, and the particular stillness of a man who has arrived at the end of something he built without realizing it was ending. I excused myself from the table as the meeting moved into logistics. I had what I came for. Bloomberg ran the story the next morning. Whitmore Systems CEO suspended amid infrastructure governance crisis. The article was thorough. It outlined the licensing dispute, the infrastructure review, the stock drop, and the board's decision in measured, factual terms. A financial analyst quoted in the piece used the phrase succession planning failure. Another described it as a case study in inherited authority without institutional literacy. The stock dropped another 3% on the open, then stabilized as the market absorbed the news that an independent operating committee was now in place. The institutional investors stopped calling the board in crisis. They started calling to assess whether the independent committee's plan was sound. The narrative had shifted entirely. 6 weeks earlier, Evan Whitmore had been the young, decisive leader stepping into a leadership position he had been groomed for since childhood, the bold new chapter for a company his father had built. Now he was the cautionary tale. The heir who had inherited the title but not the understanding. The man who had fired the architect of his own operational foundation without knowing what the foundation was. He had wanted the story to be about asserting control. He had gotten a story about not having it. It was 2 weeks after the governance session when Evan found me. I was in the parking structure beneath the Whitmore Systems building, retrieving my car after a meeting with the Independent Operating Committee, the first of what would be several renegotiation sessions. It was late. The structure was mostly empty. My heels echoed. He was leaning against the wall near the elevator bank. He looked, for the first time in my memory, genuinely tired. "You engineered this," he said. His voice was not angry. It was something more complicated than angry. The tone of a man who has spent several weeks arriving at a conclusion he did not want to reach. "I structured safeguards," I replied. I kept walking toward my car, but I didn't rush. "You knew this would happen." "I knew what the agreement contained. I did not know what decision you would make." I stopped at my car and turned to face him. "If you'd read the agreement, you would have had the same information I had. You could have warned me." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Not rage. Something more honest than rage. I assumed you had reviewed what you inherited before exercising authority over it." He looked at me for a long moment. This was my father's company. The words were not an argument. They were something else, a statement about what he believed he was entitled to, about the kind of authority he thought came with a name on a building. "And I protected it," I said, quietly and without apology. "For 17 years, I protected it. The systems, the relationships, the infrastructure that let it grow. I protected it when Daniel was building it. I protected it when he was dying. And the agreement I put in place protected it from what you just tried to do." He had nothing to say to that. I got in my car. The renegotiation took 9 weeks. I want to be precise about what happened during those 9 weeks, because precision matters and because the story circulating in financial press coverage was not entirely complete. The press framed it as a dispute resolved. It was not a dispute. It was a valuation exercise with a predictable conclusion, conducted by professionals who knew what they were looking at. The licensing terms were renegotiated at a premium valuation. The operational infrastructure was independently assessed by 2 outside firms, one specializing in logistics technology, one in enterprise data systems, and both reached essentially the same conclusion. The systems were worth considerably more than the original licensing agreement had reflected, because the original agreement had been structured conservatively at Daniel's insistence. He had told me, during the original negotiation, that he didn't want the licensing relationship to create the appearance of personal enrichment at the company's expense. He was generous in that way, and consistent, and I respected the instinct. I did not feel obligated to honor it in the renegotiation. The original terms had been fair to Whitmore Systems. The new terms were fair to market. The difference, across the licensing structure, amounted to a significant annual increase. Evan's legal team pushed back on the valuation methodology. The independent assessors held their numbers. The board, faced with the alternative, attempting to rebuild the infrastructure internally at a cost that had now been formally estimated in the range of $34 million over 18 months, approved the new terms. The convertible licensing credit mechanism was the piece that required the most negotiation time. My counsel proposed it. Whitmore Systems counsel initially resisted it on the grounds that it created an unusual equity dilution pathway. What brought them to agreement was the performance-based structure of the conversion conditions. The credits would only convert to equity if the infrastructure performed at or above defined operational benchmarks. The benchmarks were aggressive but achievable. Both sides could calculate the probability of conversion, and both sides understood that the probability was high. Over the following 9 months, the infrastructure did what it had always done. It performed. The routing algorithm processed 43 million distribution decisions across 3 quarters without a single system failure. The vendor matrix maintained 97% Tier 1 supplier reliability through 2 significant supply chain disruptions that affected the broader industry. The compliance automation engine cleared a backlog that had accumulated during the review period and returned processing times to their historical average within 6 weeks. The convertible credits exercised, tranche by tranche, in accordance with the agreement. My ownership stake in Whitmore Systems increased from 18% to 26%. I want to be clear about the emotional register of this, because people tend to imagine moments like that with a particular intensity: the satisfaction of a plan fully executed, the vindication of a position long held. What I remember is something more quiet. I received the equity confirmation in an email from my counsel on a Tuesday afternoon. I read it. I forwarded it to my accountant. I made a note in my files. Then I poured a glass of water and stood at my kitchen window and thought for a few minutes about Daniel Whitmore and the rainy November afternoon when we had sat in his office and built the structure that had just protected itself. I thought he would have found it elegant. That was the whole satisfaction of it. Not the percentage. The elegance. I did not take Evan's seat. I had no interest in running a company. I never had. That had been Daniel's instinct, not mine. What I was interested in was structure, in systems, in the architecture that makes things hold together under pressure. The CEO seat is a performance role. I have never been particularly interested in performing. I am interested in what holds the performance up. Evan remained a shareholder for a time. He attended one board meeting after the governance competency review concluded. A review that found no grounds for permanent removal but produced a set of documented recommendations about consultation protocols, legal review requirements for executive actions, and succession planning obligations that would follow him for as long as he worked in the industry. He accepted them without public comment. He attended 3 board meetings after that and then stopped appearing. No announcement. No stated reason. He simply withdrew, and the people in the room noticed without remarking on it, because everyone understood what was happening. He was already gone before he formally resigned. That is a particular kind of defeat, the kind that takes the fight out before it's official. 6 months after the governance session, he submitted his resignation letter. The press release used the phrase strategic transition, reflecting the company's evolution toward its next chapter. The markets responded with mild positive movement, the kind of quiet uptick that indicates institutional investors were relieved rather than surprised. The independent operating committee had been running effectively for nearly a year. The formal CEO search was already in its 3rd month. The infrastructure was performing at levels that made the quarterly reports clean in a way they hadn't been during the months of uncertainty. Whitmore Systems never again placed architecture under ego. The new CEO, a 49-year-old operations executive named Patricia Chen, who had spent 15 years at a global logistics platform and who, in her first week on the job, formally requested a complete review of every infrastructure agreement in the company's portfolio, called me within 60 days of joining. We spoke for 2 hours. About systems. About what holds companies together when the people at the top change. About the consistent and expensive confusion between institutional authority and institutional knowledge, and why organizations that conflate the two tend to discover the distinction at the worst possible moment. She understood immediately. We have worked well together since. There is something I want to be clear about, because it is the thing people get wrong when they hear this story. I did not do any of this because of Evan Whitmore. I did not build Prescott's strategic infrastructure as a trap. I did not write Appendix C as a weapon. I did not stay in that marriage of professional loyalty for 17 years nursing some private plan for the day someone underestimated me. I did all of it because I am an operational architect. Because I understand that systems need safeguards. Because I have seen enough companies hollow out their operational foundations in service of executive ego to know that a company's resilience needs to be built independently of whoever happens to be sitting in the corner office at any given moment. The protective clause was not written for Evan. It was written for any scenario in which operational continuity became subordinate to political convenience. Evan simply happened to be the scenario. He chose the trigger language. He chose the room with 30 witnesses. He chose to fire a woman he didn't understand in front of an audience he was trying to impress. He thought control was something he had inherited, a state of being rather than a set of capabilities, a name rather than a practice. He was wrong about that in the same way his father had been right about it. Daniel Whitmore understood that control is not inherited. It is built, maintained, and earned through an understanding of what you hold. I had given his father 17 years of that understanding. His son got the bill. The night he fired me, I drove home through empty Manhattan streets, stopped at a light on 53rd and thought about all of it, the building I had just been walked out of, the agreement sitting quietly in Appendix C, the 30 people in that room watching a man perform authority he didn't yet own. I thought about what was coming. I did not feel anger. I did not feel satisfaction, not yet. I felt the very particular calm of someone who has built a structure they trust. I knew how it was built. I knew how it would hold. That is all control ever is, knowing what you built, and trusting it to stand. He believed control was inherited. I knew it was engineered. And you cannot fire the architect of a system you don't understand, because the moment you do, you may discover you were never in control at all. You were just standing inside something she built.